Topic 8, bad emperors and good emperors. So now I'm going to do something that I don't normally do. If you remember at the beginning of this course, I said that I'm not a big fan of history as one damn thing after another. Well, that's exactly what I'm going to do now. And because that's what I'm going to do, I should explain why I'm going to do it. The reason is that the first century is often known as the century of the bad emperors. They're the bad boys, what someone once called the pornographic emperors, because sometimes they actually show up in movies because of their sexual escapades and their violence. And the second century is sometimes called the good emperors. And the point of going one emperor to the next is not just to, highlight the decadence, but to show how the first century bad emperors pale in comparison to Augustus's model, but then to demonstrate the recovery. And so one of the things that's interesting when you take a step back, and what we're going to try to do in this segment is go from about 14 CE, when Augustus dies, to about the great Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180, so let's just roughly call that 200 years, is to take a step back and say, wow, how did the empire survive that first 75 years of idiots, of malcontents, of incompetence? The answer is the system that Augustus started to put into place. And the fact that Augustus, Octavian who becomes Augustus, during his reign, that long reign from 31 BCE to 14 CE, 45 years, he had a nice long reign, put a system in place that was up and running and working, especially outside the city of Rome. It was working in the provinces and functioning and building such that the system was so good it could survive the notion that you had an emperor who was incompetent at the center. And that happens fairly rapidly in time, and I think that that is a testament to Augustus's skill and achievement of how to work out, how to run an empire. And in a later topic, we'll look a little bit more specifically as to how do you physically run an empire. And so it's remarkable that during this period of the first century bad emperors, there are very, very few voices saying the imperial system should be thrown out. If somebody doesn't like an American president, they say, we'll vote that person out, or in an extreme case, we'll impeach that president, which has only happened 2 times in history. And remember that impeachment is indictment. A president has never been voted out by a jury, meaning the Senate. Even Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, the 2 who were impeached, that doesn't mean that they were thrown out of office. And Nixon, the articles of impeachment were voted against him. No one says, let's get rid of the presidency. Let's get rid of the executive branch as it is constituted in the United States Constitution. So too, what's remarkable is that with these horrible men, nobody is saying, let's get rid of the emperor as a body, the emperor as a person and as a piece of the institution. So what happens after Augustus? The story of the first century is the increasing power of the army, which is a return to Marius and Sulla and Pompey and Crassus and Caesar. The decreasing power of government administrators in Rome, and yet the increasing power and success of government administrators outside of Rome, particularly in North Africa, Palestine, Spain, Gaul, and even up into Britain. Augustus dies without a male heir. He lives so long, he had trained a couple of people. He didn't have a firstborn son. He didn't have any legitimate sons or illegitimate that we know of. So he had his eye on a few men, but the problem was that he outlived them. Not unlike Louis XIV, the fellow who says l'état c'est moi in the 1600s, outlives his son heir, his grandson heir, and so Louis XV is actually the great-grandson of Louis XIV. And so he has Julia, his daughter, who is a little bit of a libertine, shall we say. He exiles her eventually for having an affair with Ovid, who wrote, naughty poems. And there's a very sloppy succession. And out of that succession comes Tiberius. Tiberius was, well, Augustus's opinion was, well, if these 2 or 3 other people died, I guess Tiberius would be okay. Maybe the system's going to be good enough. And Tiberius was a terrible, terrible, terrible emperor. Now, part of it is when you're following a legend. I recall, to use an analogy from the Catholic Church, when John Paul II died, I was asked a lot of questions as to who's going to be the next pope. And I would tell them, well, first off, I'm an historian, not a prophet. I don't know who would be the next pope. And a lot of people said, well, don't people want to be pope? And I said, well, would you want to be the guy who followed the guy? John Paul II was a legend. Do you really want to be the person who follows him? So there's that problem too, right? And so Tiberius is a small man in many ways, and he is certainly not Octavian, and he is certainly not Augustus, though all emperors will have the title Caesar Augustus in the future. And the defining characteristic of Tiberius is he's paranoid. Psychologists love to study these people. He saw around him threats everywhere, real and imagined. And he would have these majestas trials. We see the word majesty, the English word majesty from the Latin word majestas, trials, which were show trials. Remember Stalin's show trials, right? Where they would take somebody and they would put them up and they would put a huge trial on to say, this is what will happen to the rest of you. What happens to this man will happen to the rest of you. Tiberius is so paranoid that he actually withdraws to the island of Capri. And Capri is a castle fortress with these drops of several hundred feet straight down into the mountains and into the sea. And he would have his enemies thrown off these cliffs if they disagreed with him. And so Tiberius, the emperor, isn't even in Rome, and he's living this paranoid life on the island of Capri. And there he taps Caligula as his heir. Now, Caligula isn't even his name. Caligula means little boots. And as a boy, his dad dressed him up in a military uniform, including these little boots, and he would parade around, and the soldiers kind of adopted him, and that's what Caligula means. And Caligula is often called the pornographic emperor because of his violence and sexuality. And it's clear that Caligula was a megalomaniac to the point where, at one point he says, I will make my horse a consul. He deifies his sister with whom he may have committed incest. He thinks even of deifying himself, not only in Rome, but on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which we will look at more closely when we talk about Judaism and Rome a few topics down the line. And Caligula probably was physically raped by Tiberius himself. So we think of Caligula as this crazy person. He really is also a tragic figure. He probably never had a chance and had severe psychological damage done to him. And what now begins to happen is that the emperors begin to get knocked off by the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard is kind of like the Secret Service. And they realize that an emperor like this is a serious threat to the stability and security of the empire. And so after Caligula dies, they find Claudius. Now Claudius, some of you may know Robert Graves' famous historical novel, I, Claudius, which was made into a very popular BBC series in the 70s, I think it was, the 1970s, maybe the 80s. And Claudius drooled, he suffered from a club foot, some other physical afflictions. And we think, though, but he also wrote history and poetry. So we think he kind of played the role of a wise fool, a court jester, as a way of surviving. And the story goes that the Praetorian Guard, after having killed Caligula, see a pair of shoes underneath a curtain. And the curtain is shaking, and it's Claudius. He's absolutely frightened to death, and they pull back the curtain and, according to one story, drop to their knees and say, Hail Caesar. According to another story, Claudius bribes them with a lot of money to say, don't kill me, and they take the money not only to not kill him, but to make him emperor. And so Claudius is the next emperor. Again, not the one you would think of, not the one who was trained or brought along to be an emperor. And the Senate has been rising in power because we have had Tiberius and Caligula now for over 20 years, going on 30 years. the Senate has been recouping some of the power that it had lost under Augustus, and Claudius foolishly alienates the Senate. See, Augustus made the Senate a partner, a junior partner, but Claudius begins to alienate that Senate. So now the senators and the Praetorian guards are in cahoots with each other, and then Claudius himself ends up dead, according to the stories, poisoned by a dish of mushrooms by Nero's mother. Nero always said that mushrooms were his favorite food, and now I think we know why. And here's an example of Nero's mother. Agrippina was her name, and she couldn't be emperor herself, but how does a woman who was powerless in this situation exercise power? She becomes a kingmaker. And she puts Nero on the throne, and Nero doesn't seem to have, thanks, Mom, but really didn't want to be put on the throne. Nero, another one of these pornographic emperors, really saw himself as an artist. He was more interested in games than governing, which got him very popular among the people. When Rome burns, right, Nero fiddles while Rome burns. He probably ordered a fire set because, lo and behold, he builds a beautiful palace right at the site where the fire burns. And of course, he blames that fire on this new cult of Christians, as he calls them, the cult of Christians. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But while Rome is burning, Nero is overlooking, and the phrase Nero fiddles while Rome burns, what he was doing was he was accompanying himself on the lyre while he sang an epic poem or song that he himself had written about the fall of Troy. That tells you everything you need to know about Nero. He himself begins to think that maybe he is already a deity. Caligula had thought that way already. Why wait till my death? I can't enjoy being divine after I die. I'll just do it now. And that spelled trouble for Caligula, and it's going to spell trouble for Nero as well. In fact, Nero begins to get so frightened of his own mother that he orders her killed. He orders that a boat kind of be taken apart and put together in a very flimsy way, and she goes in the boat sinks, she swims to safety, and he is terrified when he finds out that Mama has survived. And eventually he's about to be assassinated, and he chooses to slit his own throat when the assassins are just a few feet away, and his dying words are, "What a great artist dies with me." And what follows him is a year, what we call the year of 4 incompetence, a year of 4 no-names. You don't need to know their names because they were 4 emperors or co-emperors or pretender emperors, and it all looks like the whole thing is going to collapse. Just 50 years after Augustus's achievement, what happens? One of those emperors that you may never have heard of, but was extremely important, a guy by the name of Vespasian. So up to now, all of these emperors fall under the title of the Julian Claudian emperors. That's kind of the family name. And now we have 3 emperors together, and their family name is Flavius, a father and 2 sons, a father and son number 1 and son number 2. And the first of them is Vespasian. And Vespasian puts his foot down, and stops this downward spiral. And he turns this trend after 4 incompetence in 1 year, turns it 180 degrees. And he is a man who is popular with the military, but also popular with the Senate. Instead of walking into Rome, gloriously decked out as a general, he dismounts outside the city of Rome and walks in, not dressed in his military regalia, which would be a threat, right? But dressed in the equivalent of a business suit, an everyday toga. And he greets the senators by name as he walks in, looks each of them in the eye, says, "Here I am, I'm here to serve with you." And that makes him very popular with the Senate. If he's on a horse, he's above them, right? But he's walking down just like them, just like a man, not dressed in a military uniform. And also he needs the people, so he starts building the Colosseum. In fact, nobody called it the Colosseum. They called it the Flavian Amphitheater, and it takes maybe 10, 12 years to build. His son actually is the one who dedicates it. And Vespasian, looking back, says the problem is we weren't training what we would call a dauphin, right, an heir. So I'm going to train my son, Titus. He's my elder son. And Titus played a very big role in putting the Jews down in Palestine at the final revolt. And so he had military experience and diplomatic experience. He was a worthy, well-trained successor to his father. Now, certainly in Jewish history, he's a villain. And in Christian history, he's a villain as well, as we'll see when we talk about that a few topics down. But as far as the Roman pagans, he was the one you wanted. And then he dies. You know, second sons in history have created lots of problems. Did you know that Henry VIII was a second son? Henry VII's first son was Arthur. Well, there's a name with a lot of British history behind it in mythology. And Arthur married Catherine of Aragon. But Arthur died before he got out of his teens. And Henry, the second son, decided to marry his sister-in-law and got an annulment. I got a dispensation to do that. And then years later, when he didn't have a male heir, decided that he wanted to divorce Catherine, or maybe his marriage wasn't really a marriage and needed an annulment. And the rest, as they say, is Anglican Reformation history. So Henry VIII himself was a second son. Domitian was a second son. What if Titus hadn't died? Domitian was not imperial material. He unfortunately slides back to being the decadent tyrants in the model of Tiberius and Caligula, Claudius and Nero. He rules as Dominus et Deus. That was his favorite title. Lord, Dominus et Deus, and God. And in fact, he doesn't last long either. Now, when we finally get rid of Domitian, what are we going to do? We begin the 2nd century, or good emperors. And here's the name of an emperor. Now, maybe you do know the name of Vespasian, but I bet you don't know the name of Nerva, and Nerva is one of the most important, because Nerva is a linchpin. Like Vespasian put the brakes on and did the 180-degree turn, so too Nerva is able to calm everything down. Domitian is assassinated, and the senators are now involved in the decision, and they pick an armchair politician. They pick Nerva, who is elderly. He has no son. He's a caretaker. He wants things to settle down and recover from Domitian, and he sets the stage for better men and a smoother transitions to come. What's going to happen is the emperors are now going to start to name their heirs while they're still alive and train them as junior emperors or co-emperors. And so what is a model of Nerva? I've decided to use one Republican example and one Democratic example to be ecumenical politically. The best two examples that I could give you of who Nerva would have been Bob Dole or Robert Byrd. Two men who served years in the Senate, who enjoyed broad bipartisan support, very popular in their own party and well respected, even in a begrudging way, in the other party. They knew how government operated. They knew when to push, when to pull, when to yell, when to cut a back deal. And at the end of their lives, at the end of their terms as senators, they would have been Nerva. So that's the model that you have there, a senator who was an armchair politician. And the senators decide together that the next person who should be emperor is a fellow named Trajan. And he's named co-emperor with Nerva during Nerva's life, so that there's no question, there's none of this scene of Claudius cowering behind the curtain. Everybody knows immediately what's going to happen. The king is dead, long live the king? No question. He's the commander of the Rhine legions, and he has a decision. Should I dominate or should I be a prince? To use the Latin expressions, should the model that he follows be dominatio? That's what Tiberius and Caligula, Claudius and Nero, and Domitian, isn't that helpful, dominatio, Domitian? That's what they had done, and look what happened to them. Or should I be more of a principatus? Should I be more of a ruling prince bound in this constitutional monarchy, even though it's really an empire, but I'm in some partnership with the Senate, or at least I make the Senate think that they're partners? Yes. The model, Trajan says, that I will follow is as principatus. And so in the reign of Nerva, they damn Domitian's name. They cross his name out. They chisel it out. They break his statues. And here is Trajan. And Trajan has a very long run. So Nerva's emperor for about 3 years. And then Trajan is emperor for about 20 years. A nice stabilizing reign. And he goes out deliberately to win over what's called the SPQR. If you go to Rome today, on manhole covers, on sides of buildings, you will see SPQR. You know, on the sides of buildings where it says, "For God and country" in the United States, In God we trust on a cornerstone. SPQR stood for the Latin Senatus Populusque Romani. There's rather odd construction in the Latin language that if you have two nouns and you put a que at the end of the second noun, the que means and. So Senatus Populusque, the Senate and the people, Romani, of Rome. So everything I do, Trajan says, is for the Senate and people of Rome. So he's winning over plebeians and patricians, populares and optimates. And he's a very, very powerful man. And because he was up in the Rhineland, we now get the final push up on the northern frontier to secure that border along the Rhine and the Danube. And now we're at the lip of the hugest size of the Roman Empire at its height. And Trajan decides, I'm going to look around, I'm going to find a fine young man, and it's Hadrian. And he gets the Senate to agree. So it's not just his own choice, he's doing this in collaboration with the Senate, and Hadrian is named co-emperor and heir apparent, so that when Trajan dies, there will be a smooth transition. And Hadrian, too, cultivated the Senate. When he found out that Trajan had died, he was out of town, and he immediately sends a letter. What happens is that word is out that Trajan has died, and his men in his army, in Hadrian's army, hail him as emperor. They raise him up on a shield, and they shout out all of the titles, and he immediately sends a letter to the Senate saying, I'm sorry. I didn't tell them to do this. Yeah, right. I didn't want them to praise me. Yeah, right. But I'm coming as your duly noted, duly selected emperor. And he rushes back to Rome, and he does the same thing. He walks into Rome. He's not mounted. He wears a business suit, an everyday toga, not imperial garb or a military uniform. So he had learned his lesson well from Vespasian. And then he decides, wow, I've got a really big empire. I think I'm going to go look at it. And so he reigns for about 20 years, and he spends a good portion of that 20 years traveling on what is later called a royal progress, when Queen Elizabeth wanted everyone to see her, right? You can't just, say, gee, I wonder what Hadrian looks like. You can't click on Google to find him. So he goes, and what is he doing? He's spreading the notion that you out in the hinterland are as much emperor as I am emperor. I remember during the papacy of John Paul II, someone asked him, why do you travel so much? And he said, because I am the Pope of everyone, and everyone has a right to see the Pope. And that's kind of what Hadrian was doing. But what was happening was that by dint of Hadrian traveling, everybody started to do public works projects, because you don't want Hadrian coming to town and tripping and falling off of his horse because his horse stumbles on a pothole. So the whole empire gets kind of this tune-up, gets this spring cleaning, and he tours the entire empire. He goes all the way up to the tip of Scotland, and he says, gee, this is a good place for a wall. And he puts his men to work building a wall, partially to keep military people occupied, because you always want to have military people occupied, because if they're not occupied, they may think about revolting. But not to keep barbarians out, that word barbarian, which is a loaded term, non-Romans, because when you look at Hadrian's wall, almost every mile or so, a Roman mile is roughly equivalent to our mile, there's an outpost to let people come in and out. So it's very clear that the wall wasn't designed to keep people out. It was just to control the flow of people and goods back and forth. So he goes from one edge to another edge, and the two examples that I'm giving you are Hadrian's Wall and Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem has been a backwater since 70 CE or AD, when Vespasian had ordered his son Titus to level the place. Let not a stone be left upon a stone. And he decides that he's going to rebuild the city. There had been a little local revolt that's put down at the end, something called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And then he decides that he's going to build Jerusalem as a model to his family. And he calls it the Aelia Capitolina, because Aelius was his family name. And he says, look, you can be as far away, you can be in the boondocks, as far away from the center of Rome as possible, and you can still have a temple, a theater, a bathhouse, all the good things that you would have in Rome. He's followed by Antoninus Pius, who had been designated by Hadrian, who was very permissive on religion. In fact, he's called pious because he allowed Christians to worship. And then by the famous Stoic philosopher, King Marcus Aurelius, who embodied what Plato and Aristotle had in mind as a philosopher king. He is the emperor at its height, embodying all of the virtue. This is the high point.